It's my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Lincoln P. Bloomfield, Jr., the chairman of the Stimson Center, who has featured yesterday a long article on the National Interest website called A Plan for Syria. And Ambassador Bloomfield first aired this plan a few weeks ago at a lunch at the Center for the National Interest. And I found it so compelling that I asked him if we could revise it and feature it on the website. And today I have the pleasure of being able to discuss with Ambassador Bloomfield his article. Ambassador Bloomfield, in 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, McGeorge Bundy was head of the National Security Council, and he convened a meeting during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he said, "Gentlemen, what would Henry Stimson have done?" So my question to you today is, what would Henry Stimson advise us to do in the Syria crisis? And what do you think his counsel would be?
Well, that's a very difficult question, and I probably can't do justice to what he would have done. However, I think Stimson was known as being farsighted and seized at all times with his view of the national interest. And both from his time as a lawyer and businessman, as well as a government employee, as well as a national public servant, Stimson always placed the national interest ahead of personal gain. And he reflected, I think, an optimism about America and its role as a generous friend to the world, someone who could impart, a country that could impart by its own example and by its assistance sort of benefits to societies that were emerging from feudalism or early industrialization and could learn from the United States. So I think Stimson's view, if I may say so, would be compatible with the motives behind the piece that I published yesterday.
Very, very intriguing answer, and it jives with what I've read of Stimson over the years. My first question to you about your piece would be, you call Syria a wicked problem. What makes it particularly wicked in your view?
That's an excellent question, and I didn't feed it to you, just for the record, because what I wanted the readers in Washington to take from the article was not that the problem was entirely that Syria was so complicated, but that the United States, the toolkit that the United States is using, the culture within the national security bureaucracy, which is staffed by outstanding patriotic people, but so many of them that they're spending their days trying to coordinate with one another rather than having an impact in places like Syria. I wanted to show that what makes it wicked is partly us.
And why do you think that we're witnessing such a sclerotic process in the bureaucracy? I know that's one of the themes that you emphasized during your talk and in your article. What has transpired in Washington over the past several decades, or is this a unique feature to the Obama administration?
No, it's not political. Although each party has its own contribution to the issue. I'm simply reflecting my age and experience. I'm thinking back to the government that I first knew in the Reagan administration, in the sense that you had far fewer decision makers in high power, and even assistant secretary level decision makers in foreign policy were much fewer than they are today. And they would spend time in the Oval Office with the president. They had access to the decisions that were in front of the president on a real-time basis, and they knew that a small room full of them, even 3 or 4 or 5, could set policy for the United States. And it was a much more activist period, if I may say so. What's happened, if we can go backwards to McGeorge Bundy and Kennedy, President Kennedy could pick up the phone and call the Assistant Secretary of State and have a conversation and would know that person. I dare say it's a little bit like marbles in a bowl, but I think there are more than 40 Assistant Secretaries of State. And so things have changed, partly because we've engaged in symbolism. We think it's important to show that something is important, so we make a bureau, and we put an organization and a title and a confirmed position behind it. I think it's fair to say that Secretary of State Kerry has 80 direct reports to him. 80 people, each of whom say they report to the Secretary of State. I defy any manager to be be able to have 80 direct reports and call that an efficient organization.
Ambassador Bloomfield, I would like to return to that in a second, but I feel compelled to discuss today's headline in the context of your article, which is that we are reading reports that the Syrian government, such as it is deploying its stock of chemical weapons on defenseless civilians. What is your assessment of both the impact of this, if this is true, and how does that affect your argument for intervention in Syria? Though I know you're not arguing for direct intervention.
The reports, as with any Middle East event, have spurned a lot of speculation. Do we know for a fact that that chemical weapons were fired? Do we know that these were actually casualties that just happened? Is it what it looks like? That's typical of the Middle East. Let's assume that it's true. I start with the proposition that the United States has a huge bureaucracy, many of whose offices are named after the problem of weapons of mass destruction. We have non-proliferation. We have counter-proliferation. WMD was the first half of every sentence during President George W. Bush's administration, along with terrorism. Both of them are in great evidence in Syria today. So what are all of these offices doing? I start with the answer, maybe nothing. They're not engaged. They're not impacting this problem. So it starts with, what does our bureaucracy have to bring to the table? What do we know? Is there a 24/7 operation inside the White House that is trying to get a grip on the situation, and also red teams and sort of, tiger teams that are coming forward with different options for the principals to consider? I hope so, but I don't sense that that is going on. So it really starts with, we've made this a signature issue for a reason. If the Syrian regime is able to deploy chemical weapons repeatedly and nothing is done and there's no consequence, the precedent will be set in several theaters around the world. Is this something that the United States can tolerate with equanimity? So I think it's both a case of, had we never done anything about WMD, we should be mobilizing about it right now. But the fact is that the prohibition against the use of chemical weapons runs deep. There's an international convention. There are norms. This goes back to the World War I. So the fact that we're not reacting, I think, also has tremendous consequences. And so I think it's time for serious people to mobilize. And I'm not telling them what to do or when, but the fact that we seem to be letting it pass could be a very regrettable decision by the United States.
So this goes even beyond the red line that President Obama enunciated. It's not just a personal red line, but you're saying that this is a violation of international norms that the United States cannot countenance, or if it does countenance it, it will severely erode our standing.
There are years when the State Department diplomats have sort of, barnstormed the world, signing up foreign governments to the Chemical Weapons Convention. This was a signature event for those countries that helped organize it. The fact that chemical weapons seem to have been used, in fact, the White House announced that they, with high confidence, the intelligence community said that chemical weapons had been used. This announcement was made in June. Now we see this latest event. That may also be the case. I think all eyes are on the United States. What are we going to do about it? Now, the red line itself was troublesome. I testified over a year ago to the House Foreign Affairs Committee on chemical weapons in Syria, and the discussion of a possible red line arose. And my comment was that either party in power would exercise its own careful tradecraft so as not to set a red line on chemical weapons that sent the wrong message, the message that anything short of chemical weapons is fine, we don't care, use helicopter gunships, use fighter aircraft, use artillery and tanks, destroy villages, drive 100,000 people out of the country and displace 6 million, kill 100,000 people and displace 6 million people. And that's fine as long as you don't use chemical weapons. Unfortunately, it appears that the Obama administration did not exercise careful tradecraft in drawing the red line. And in my article, I suggested that the red line should have been crafted with a different kind of consequence than the presumption of military response. Military response might be called for, but we shouldn't have sort of set a tripwire that we couldn't control for the use of military force. I would have preferred that we begin to put together certain multilateral support for crimes against humanity prosecution for the breaching of a grave international norm.
I'd like to get into that in just 1 second, but your comment is so intriguing. It makes me think that what the Obama administration is doing is a sin of omission rather than commission. That what you're really saying, at least in the first part of your answer, is that there's more than one way to shred an international convention. It can be shredded as much by inactivity as by a willful breach, if you follow what I'm saying. The Bush administration was often accused of abrogating, deliberately abrogating international agreements. But what I'm inferring from your remarks is that there is another way inadvertently to shred an international agreement as well, if you don't insist on adhering to the clauses that nations have signed up for.
Well, I agree with that. But I would also say that the International Convention, like the United Nations and all international architecture, is the creature of nation states. The only sovereign sort of currency in the game are sovereign states. The United States, presumably foremost among them. So we've spent years building up bureaucratic agencies, reputation for supporting and demanding support for these norms. And then when something happens, and you could say it's omission, but it seems as though we are almost exercising amnesia. Mm-hmm. People are looking at us. We have high-ranking officials whose portfolio is this precise situation: war crimes, weapons of mass destruction. Where are they? And in a sequestration environment, if I could be really blunt, if these bureaus deserve to be funded any further, this is the time when they should be in the Oval Office with the president, figuring out what to do. That's all they exist for this moment. And the fact that the United States is doing nothing must have foreign ministries around the world commenting and tutting about whatever happened to the Americans. And is this going to be a pattern in all of our foreign policy engagement?
Could it be that the president does not want to see these officials?
Well, I did say that in the article in a respectful way. I don't want to politicize my message. Elections matter. The president won. He's my president. And I'll say that as a five-time Republican appointee. He's my president. I want him to succeed in foreign policy. There's a novel thought. But the fact is that he obviously sees a lot of terrible things going on. I'm not his apologist, but clearly no president would welcome the idea of diving into Syria with a lot of resources and raising expectations. But I've come full circle on the view that protecting the president from bad things is kind of an obsolete concept in this situation. We need to care about what's happening in Syria. We need to look at the end of where this movie goes and what it's going to look like if we allow all the other forces that are pushing very, very hard on the outcome to have their way. We must push back. And does that mean military force? My answer is, if it must be military force, then we have no imagination at all. So I'm also in this article calling for an America that becomes clever again, as they were in 1962.
Well, this is a perfect segue to my next question, which is the heart of your essay, which is what is to be done in the famous phrase. And could you explicate for us how should America approach this? You have a number of suggestions in there about how we should arm the rebels and then how this should be done, what the conditions are, the constraints that we should observe. I think it would be very interesting to hear your thoughts.
Well, I don't want to mislead your viewers, because there were two messages in this article. One was that doing nothing in Syria will bring terrible consequences, worse than doing something. It's a little bit like sequestration. If you just allow random budget cuts, you'll cut some irrelevant things and you'll cut some vital things. And that's exactly what we'll face if we allow everyone but America to have their oar in the water and pull for their interests in Syria, and we don't pay attention to where that could lead. The question of what to do about it gets to my second message, which is I really wanted people to look at an ambitious sort of reimagining of the U.S. toolkit and say, boy, that's not even close to how we do business today. I knew people would say that. They did say that. In fact, your vice chairman of the center, Dov Zakheim, who's a close friend and a very trusted colleague, perfectly played the role of the veteran senior official who said, boy, 1% of this would be a hard lift in Washington today. That was my point. That was my point. I'm not here to say, let's do all of these unrealistic things. I'm here to say, look how much different it would be if we used military power only sparingly behind the demands of a civilian commander who was talking directly to Bashar al-Assad and said, your family has 45 days, and I have a place for you to go. They'll never be involved in Syria again. Gather your possessions. You can take some money with you. But if you don't go in 45 days, I can't vouch for your safety. And by the way, the Alawite homeland hasn't been touched in this entire battle. So there hasn't even been a streak of fear through the families of all these people who run the regime. That was what I'm getting at, is that my mom's a Kiwi, a New Zealander, and it's a New Zealand expression. If I could borrow a New Zealand expression, we need to start addressing these problems from the neck up. We've been exhausting our blood and treasure by trying to coerce problems with muscle, with hard power, which is fine, but where's the message? Where's the part that says, if you do this, we won't shoot at you anymore? When you ask the Pentagon, and I spent 8 years there, I have huge respect for the military, they've been overtaxed by the dearth of clever policy to accompany the use of military force. If you ask them, what could we do, they will say, well, we could take out the Syrian Air Force. If you take out Bashar al-Assad's military, he'll use chemical weapons because he has nothing left. So I don't take out his Air Force. I shock them with a few uses of military force, followed immediately by a demand. It's all about the political demand. We want them to do our bidding willingly or face consequences. And harmonizing these messages, including media messages, which you can read about, we don't do information operations very much, and I can't talk about it, but it's in the article. This is a new branch of a tool of influence that I think is extraordinarily important and gives me optimism that we could leverage these situations without military power or in conjunction with it. So this is a case of trying to fight the problem in a new way from the neck up that is all about psychologically persuading our adversaries to back off and giving them an out and essentially coercing the situation politically with the use of inducements of all kinds, not just military.
Do you feel that the military has become, if I can use the term, gun-shy, when you see General Martin Dempsey declaring that that it would be reckless to intervene right now and there's no side that's on our side, so we should just steer clear of it?
I've thought about this, and I don't. I think that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was asked by the Congress to provide something. I'm sure he did it reluctantly. I didn't know whether, I probably assumed it would leak. I believe a lot of homework and a lot of assessment went behind the letter that he sent with the options. I think it put him in a tough spot because he knows that he's supposed to be advising the president. I do not blame the chairman for that, and I don't think the military is gun-shy. I think they are always willing to go when directed. But the problem is we've never learned to take military force as a tool without sort of handing the entire problem set to the Department of Defense. And when you do that, it's not whole of government anymore. And I like the Pentagon. They do the best they can, but we leave babies in bassinets squealing at the doorstep of the Pentagon in lieu of being clever and figuring out what else do we have that we could be doing with diplomacy, with, to create a mandate for action, to sort of change the political message and the environment, and to show momentum, to show commitment, and in that way engender support on the street of Syria, as well as around the Arab world, as well as in Europe, and to show that we're still here, that we're smart enough to figure this out. We know something about Syria, believe it or not. We really do. I was the Lebanon desk officer for years in the Pentagon and know a lot about Syria from the time the Marines were in Beirut. It's a tough time, but we read the intelligence morning, noon, and night. And so, yes, this matters. And there are a lot of people who know something about Syria. They should all be pulled in, and we should figure this out without another Iraq or Afghanistan style intervention.
As a final question, I'd like to ask you to elaborate on your comment that doing nothing is the worst of all worlds. And if we do continue down this path where we remain aloof, as President Obama clearly would like to remain, what do you think will be the consequences, not just for Syria, but also for Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, the rest of the Middle East? What will happen if Syria remains in this state of an inconclusive civil war and it becomes increasingly murderous?
Well, it's hard to see how it would become increasingly murderous. But in the absence of a coordinated effort, and by the way, there is no other country than the United States who could summon essentially the Western world and willing countries in Asia, sort of the global responsibles, to back a unified effort, including post-conflict assistance, promises of assistance, and some sort of common sheet of principles that involve protection of women, protection of minorities, elections which remain contested and participatory, if I could use those terms, rather than simply a vote. We should stand for something, because if you don't stand for something, then there is no horizon on that side. The only horizon you see are what you're seeing today. And if people don't recognize that Iran's regime is in part keeping itself legitimate at home by being essentially the power in the Levant, and that it's very important to them to rescue this non-religious regime, this Alawite secular regime of Bashar al-Assad, which is quite a contradiction for a fundamentalist Islamic state. And they're spending $6 billion a year doing it, and no one is calling them out on this. Meanwhile, they're supporting Hezbollah, which has no purpose of existence in Lebanon today. They're supposed to be resisting Israeli occupation. There is none. The Shabbat Farms thing was a complete fiction. So they've lost their mission. They're killing Arabs in Syria. They're dying in Syria, thinking that they're doing something important. We should be calling them out on this. There's a lot of sort of lucrative political territory there for the United States to exploit. It's not about guns, boots, and blowing things up. This is a political situation where finally people who've aggressed against the United States are vulnerable. And if we don't stop them, then Iran will be stronger in the Levant. Hezbollah will establish itself as a fully formed military quasi-state. And then these jihadists who are flowing into the Sunni area will be contesting for power with the Sunni majority that has been denied under the Alawites all this time. Somewhere in the Sunni part of Syria will arise a very ugly leadership, which won't respect any rights. And all of this is right on Israel's border, and Jordan's border, and Iraq's border, and Turkey's border, and Lebanon's border. I don't see this getting any better by just watching the fire burn. This is a fire that's burning right in our, this is an urban area with a lot of American interests. This isn't some forest fire where there's no American equities. And anyone who thinks that America has no interests in this game and can sort of let whatever's going to happen, I think is probably missing a great deal of vision on the geopolitical front. I think this is very important, and it's going to get much worse if we don't try to stop it.
Ambassador Bloomfield, thank you for these extremely compelling comments.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Appreciate it.